The orphan who asked Elon Musk one question about God and left the world speechless. The auditorium was packed, buzzing with voices, cameras flashing, and curious minds eager to hear from the man who was shaping the future. Elon Musk had arrived in a remote, underprivileged country to speak about technology, space exploration, and the hope of tomorrow. Journalists filled the front rows. Students in uniforms lined the aisles. But in the back corner of the room, almost invisible, sat a little girl, 10 years old, wrapped in a simple scarf. Her face calm, her eyes quietly watching everything. Her name was Mariam. She was an orphan. Elon took the stage with the confidence the world had come to know. He spoke of Mars, artificial intelligence, and the dream of turning humanity into a multiplanetary species. Applause filled the room. Then came the QA session. Microphones moved around. Students asked questions about physics, economics, and innovation. Elon answered with precision, sometimes with humor. Then, a tiny hand went up. The volunteer holding the mic hesitated. She wasn't on the list, but something in her gaze made them walk toward her. Standing now, Mariam's voice barely carried through the mic, but every word was like a thread weaving silence into the air. "Mr. Elon," she said, "if science can explain the stars, who wrote the laws that made them shine?" The room froze. For the first time that day, Elon Musk didn't have an answer ready. His lips parted slightly, his eyes fixed on the girl. He looked thoughtful, maybe even shaken, not by confrontation, but by purity, by something that pierced through layers of logic. The cameras zoomed in, every breath in the auditorium slowed. Elon finally responded, not with certainty, but with honesty. "That's a beautiful question," he said. "I've spent my life trying to understand the universe, the equations, the particles, the gravity that holds it all together. But who wrote the laws?" He paused. "I don't know." Mariam nodded, not as a victory, but as a gentle signal that she wasn't here to argue. "I don't ask to win, sir," she said softly. "I just wonder, maybe faith isn't the opposite of science. Maybe it's what gives us the courage to explore it." The room stirred. Someone near the front whispered, "Who is this child?" A whisper of wind seemed to pass through the hearts of the listeners, not cold, but sacred, the kind that doesn't demand belief, but invites it. That stirs questions, not answers. That asks the viewers watching later, what laws govern wonder? What if reason and reverence can walk side by side? Was it possible that a 10-year-old orphan just opened a door millions had forgotten was there? The silence lingered, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Elon Musk, a man of engineering, of futures built with silicon and fire, found himself at the edge of something quieter, deeper. He cleared his throat, not to speak but to buy time. Then he looked at Mariam and said, "You know, I often talk about simulations, that maybe we're living in one. But I've never really asked, who's running it? Not seriously. Your question makes me wonder, not just about the universe, but about meaning." Mariam tilted her head, her expression unchanging, peaceful. "Maybe the one who runs it isn't trying to control us," she said. "Maybe he just wants us to look up and ask." The cameras caught Elon leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. "But what if the universe doesn't need meaning? What if it's all random, particles dancing to rules no one wrote?" She looked down for a moment, thoughtful. Then she said, "Sir, if your mother wrote you a letter and you didn't know the language, would you call it random? Or would you try to learn how to read it?" The crowd stirred again, a few audible gasps breaking through the tension. It wasn't just a reply. It was poetry in the shape of logic. Faith in the form of a child's reasoning. Even Elon smiled faintly. "That's a profound way of looking at things," he admitted. "But how do you know it's not just your mind making you believe something because it's comforting?" Mariam nodded slowly, as if she'd thought about this before. "I don't believe because it's comforting," she said. "I believe because when I pray, I feel heard. Even when nothing changes, something inside me does." And that was the moment, the precise moment, when the conversation stopped being a debate. It turned into something else, a moment of vulnerability between a man of power and a child with none, between someone who had everything and someone who had lost everything except her wonder. In the audience, a girl in the third row whispered, "I've never seen him like this." The video, now circulating online in fragments, had already begun gathering millions of views. But people weren't sharing it to take sides. They weren't praising one answer over another. They were sharing it because something inside them stirred. Something that wasn't about proof, but about permission. The permission to ask questions no textbook would grade. Questions like, why are we here? Is faith a weakness or a kind of sight? Can we build the future without understanding who built us? The world watched and listened, not for Elon's intellect or Mariam's innocence, but for the space between their words. A sacred space where disagreement wasn't war and curiosity wasn't a weapon. It was a conversation, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something much bigger. The moderator approached, gently indicating that the time for questions was nearly over. But Elon raised a hand, not to end it, but to extend it. "Let her speak," he said. "Please." Miriam blinked, surprised, not at the attention, but at the kindness in his tone. She looked at Elon and asked, "When you were a child, sir, did you ever believe in God?" Elon hesitated. A flicker of memory crossed his face, too fast to catch, too real to fake. "Yes," he said softly, "I did. For a while." "What changed?" she asked, with no challenge in her voice. "Just care." He sighed. "I saw suffering. I saw people cry for help and nothing answered. I saw children hungry, wars started in God's name, and people using faith to silence questions. So I chose reason. Because reason didn't lie." Miriam nodded, her eyes lowering. Then she looked back up and said, "Maybe some people lie about God, but that doesn't mean God is the lie." The crowd shifted, many of them stunned by the depth of the conversation, how it flowed like a river over stone, soft but unrelenting. "You know," Elon said slowly, "I spend billions to explore space, but it's strange. The farther we go, the lonelier it feels, like we're chasing light but forgetting what light is for." Miriam's voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard it. Maybe we were never meant to escape Earth just to survive. Maybe we were meant to understand why it was gifted to us. The auditorium became still again, not the frozen silence of shock, but of hearts turning inward. What had started as a science lecture had transformed into a spiritual mirror. Elon looked out over the audience, his voice heavier now. "You know, when people think of the future, they imagine machines, planets, upgrades. But this conversation, maybe this is the future too." Miriam smiled, not proudly, just peacefully. "Maybe the future isn't just in rockets," she said. "Maybe it's in remembering we have a soul before we have a spaceship." And then she asked a question, not to Elon, but to everyone listening. What if the stars were never meant to be conquered, only understood? Phones in the crowd recorded, but no device could fully capture the weight of the moment. The questions Miriam asked were not made to be answered in a day. They were made to live inside people, to unsettle them lovingly, to remind them of wonder. Online, the clip spread like fire, but not the kind that burns, the kind that warms. Comments poured in. "I'm an atheist, but this girl, she made me feel something I haven't in years. I'm a scientist," and I cried. She didn't argue, she just believed. The crowd stood still, some leaning forward, others wiping away quiet tears they hadn't expected. Elon Musk sat differently now, no longer the speaker above the crowd, but a man among them, just another soul, listening. After a long pause, he spoke again, quieter than before. "Miriam," he said, "you're only 10, but your words feel ancient. Where did you learn to speak like that?" She looked at him and shrugged gently. "When you don't have much, you spend more time listening, to the wind, to people's hearts, to silence. And sometimes," she added, "silence speaks back." Elon nodded slowly, deeply affected. "Do you ever get angry at God?" he asked. "For taking your parents? For putting you in an orphanage?" Miriam looked away briefly, her lips pressing together. The question was heavier than all the others, but she didn't run from it. "Yes," she admitted. "Sometimes I cry and I ask, why me? But sometimes I remember, even in stories, the heroes lose something before they find their purpose." The audience exhaled, as if they, too, had been holding pain they never dared to speak aloud. "And maybe," she continued, "it's not about having everything but finding meaning in what's left." Elon leaned back, quiet, not defeated, changed. "You know," he said, "people follow me because they think I have answers. But you're teaching me something else, that maybe the most important questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be carried." Miriam smiled again, not out of pride, but the simple joy of being understood. She then reached into her pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. "My mother wrote this before she died," she said. "I don't show it to many people, but I feel I should." She unfolded the note slowly, hands trembling slightly. "It says, 'Miriam, the world may forget your name, but if you live with light in your heart, the one who made the stars will never forget you.'" A soft gasp rippled through the audience. The words weren't scientific, they weren't philosophical, but they held a gravity that equations couldn't measure. And Elon, a man of science, said nothing, not because he lacked words, but because, for the first time in a long time, he realized not every truth needs to be spoken aloud. The cameras kept rolling. The internet kept watching, but what people saw wasn't a debate. It was a child, reminding the world of its soul. In comment sections, strangers asked each other things no one had dared in years. Do you still believe? What did you dream of when you were a child? When was the last time wonder made you cry? Miriam didn't win the argument. She didn't need to, because sometimes changing a mind is less powerful than opening a heart. The applause that followed was soft at first, not because the moment lacked power, but because no one wanted to break it. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was something quieter, more reverent, the kind of applause you give not to a performer, but to a prayer you didn't know you needed. Miriam sat down again, almost disappearing into the sea of students. Elon looked at her once more, then turned to the crowd. I came here to talk about the future, he said slowly, but I think the future just spoke back to me. He looked around the auditorium, eyes meeting the faces of teachers, engineers, students, and children. This little girl reminded me that progress without purpose is just movement, that science without soul is just noise. He paused, then added, and maybe, just maybe, we need both. A few hours later, the video was uploaded online. It wasn't edited, it wasn't polished, it didn't need to be, because sometimes raw truth carries its own light. And that night, something strange began to happen. Not on Wall Street, not in laboratories, but in living rooms, dorm rooms, and quiet spaces across the globe. A teenage boy in Sweden who had never prayed whispered his first uncertain prayer. A woman in Canada who had lost her faith watched the video with tears streaming down her cheeks. A man in Japan who had spent decades in silence finally called his estranged daughter and said, "I believe again. I don't know why. I just do." It wasn't because Miriam proved anything. It was because she reminded people that their questions were still holy. The next day, a reporter interviewed Elon Musk. "What did you feel in that moment when she asked that question?" the reporter asked. Elon paused, looked at the camera, and said, "For the first time in a long time, I felt small, but not in a bad way. I felt human." "And do you believe in God now?" Elon didn't answer quickly. "I believe," he finally said, "that believing might be more important than knowing, and that maybe the question she asked wasn't just for me, it was for all of us." In the orphanage, Miriam returned to her simple room. No red carpets, no interviews, just a bed, a few books, and a folded piece of paper from her mother. She prayed that night, not for fame, not for recognition, but that people would hear her question and look up at the stars and wonder again. And across the world, millions did. Because in the end, what moved them wasn't an argument. It was the quiet faith of a little girl who had every reason to stop believing, and yet didn't. Not because life was easy, but because hope was real. Weeks passed. The viral moment became more than a trend. It became a conversation, and not the kind that fades with time. It echoed, quietly, deeply, in schools, cafes, homes, and even boardrooms. A clip of Miriam's words was projected in a university philosophy class. A church in Brazil began its Sunday service by replaying her voice. A group of scientists added her quote to their whiteboard, "Believing in God doesn't stop us from exploring the stars. It gives us a reason to reach for them." But Miriam remained untouched by it all. In her orphanage, she returned to her daily routines, reading quietly, helping younger children, whispering prayers when the world was loud. She had no idea she had started a movement. She had only done what her heart asked her to, speak truth without fear. Elon, however, couldn't forget her. He began mentioning her words in interviews, not just as a story, but as a lens. "I used to think human advancement meant removing faith," he told a global tech summit. "Now I think maybe it means rediscovering it. Not religion, not dogma, but that childlike faith that we're part of something bigger." He funded new initiatives, not to convert, but to create spaces where science and philosophy could meet, where engineers and thinkers could ask questions not just about how, but why. One day a small envelope arrived at the orphanage. Inside was a letter. It read, "Dear Miriam, you reminded me that even rockets can't carry us to the places only the soul can reach. Thank you for helping me remember that wonder matters, that the questions we carry in our hearts are not flaws, but fuel. You may never stand on Mars, but you already helped the world look up again. With gratitude, Elon." There was no money enclosed, no offer of adoption, just words, and somehow that meant more. Miriam smiled when she read it. She folded the letter and placed it beside her mother's note under her pillow. Two voices from two worlds, now resting side by side. And across the world, as screens dimmed and the noise of daily life returned, something had quietly changed. Not because people had found answers, but because they were finally unafraid to ask the questions. In a time when debates often divided, a 10-year-old orphan had started a dialogue that united. She didn't raise her voice, she raised a question, and in doing so, she reminded the world that belief isn't blindness. It's the courage to see more, to wonder, to reach, to remember that maybe, just maybe, the one who made the stars also placed a light within us, not to shine alone, but to remind one another how to find our way home.